Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie and today we are getting back on the big book challenge train. If you've been around here for a little while, you will know that I have a terminal fear of big books. And once upon a time when I was primarily like a lit fic reader, that was an okay fear to have. But since I've gotten more into genre fiction, especially fantasy, it's become more and more necessary for me to expose myself to larger books and to get over this fear. At the beginning of the year, I set myself a challenge of reading 10 books over 500 pages throughout 2023. And I have read 2 big books so far this year and vlogged the whole process. They didn't go very well. I didn't like either of them. However, at the end of February, I had a mental health crisis that I've kind of been working my way through over the past several months, which meant I was barely reading at all, let alone tackling my big book fear. It's been rough out here, what can I say? But before all of this happened, my patrons did indeed select a book for me that I was supposed to read in March. They chose The Golem and The Djinni by Helene Wecker. So I might be 4 months late to the party, but we're gonna be starting this book today. Better late than never, right? This is an historical fantasy book that was originally published in 2014, but I had never heard of it before discovering it in my local bookshop. It's set in New York in 1899, and our 2 main characters are the Golem and the Djinni. And the blurb says, together, experiencing freedom for the first time, they form the most unlikely of friendships. But a powerful threat will soon test their bond, driving them back into their own worlds and forcing them to make a fateful choice. And it's described as a bold and extraordinary fairy tale. It also has a lot of love over on GoodReads. And when I first picked this up, I did think that it was a standalone. However, I've since discovered that it's a duology, I think. So, I mean, if this goes well, I might just be adding another big book to my list, but let's not dwell on that for now. Now, this book is about 650 pages long, certainly nothing to sneeze at, and I do have access to the audiobook through Scribd, which I will be utilizing. When I said that we were starting this book today, that was a little bit of a lie. I actually started this last night. I read the first chapter just to get a taste. That was the first 24 pages or so, and oh my god, what an opening to a book. I was hooked immediately. The first character we're introduced to is Rotfield. Now, he is kind of like a middle-aged, sleazy guy living in Poland. It seems like he inherited a bit of wealth, but because he's a bit of an arrogant prick, he lost most of that wealth. And he has 2 goals. One is to go to America and the other is to find a wife. Unfortunately for him, he is, as we mentioned, an arrogant prick, and he's also not very attractive and he's not very wealthy. So he's having trouble finding a wife. So in desperation, he decides to contact a man named Shulman, who is rumored to be a disgraced rabbi with supernatural powers. Ooh, good job. I'm getting so excited I'm spilling tea on myself. Maybe I should just put this down. Anyway, Rotfield finds this man and asks him to make him a golem in the shape of a woman. A golem is essentially like a creature made out of clay designed to serve their master. They're super strong and powerful and very loyal and obedient. And so this request is a little bit creepy and seedy, obviously, but with what's left of his inheritance, Rotfield can pay, so Shulman is willing to do it. Shulman asks Rotfield what he wants this woman to be like, and he starts describing like physical attributes. And Shulman says, no, in terms of the personality, what do you want? And he's expecting to hear something like, you know, this sex kitten who can also treat me like my mum, which is what he's found men like Rotfield usually want from their women. But instead he says he wants her to be obedient, which obviously she already will be given that she's a golem. But then he adds that he despises stupid women, so he wants her to be intelligent, and he also wants her to be curious. And Shulman kind of laughs to himself, wondering if this man really knows what he's asking for, an intelligent, curious woman. But he goes ahead anyway and does as Rotfield has requested and makes him a wife. After a couple of weeks, she's finished, and Rotfield comes in and sees that she looks almost identical to an actual human woman. But she's not awake yet. They've decided together that the best plan of action would to keep her asleep and put her in a crate while Rotfield makes the trip from Poland to New York. So Rotfield agrees and he boards the ship with his crate with his clay wife. But while on the ship, he starts to get some serious like abdomen pain and he starts to get a bit of a fever and then starts to worry that maybe he's just spent his entire life inheritance on a lump of clay that isn't going to wake up. So in a moment where his pain and panic are kind of mixing together, he rushes down to like find the crate where the golem is. He opens it up and he says the magic words to wake her up. And she does. She comes alive. All she knows is who her master is, that's Rotfield, and that she is a golem designed to serve him. But she also quickly realizes that her master is in an awful lot of pain because she has like this mental connection with him and she can feel that sensation in herself. So she knows something's wrong, so she like says that you need help and she like takes him up to the top of the ship and asks for help, and a doctor comes. By this point, Rotfield is not looking very well and he's in a lot of pain. And so a doctor kind of rushes over, realizes what's happening and presses on his side, which makes Rotfield scream out in agony. Immediately, the golem, who is designed to protect her master, like grabs at the doctor, but luckily Rotfield says, no, he's a doctor, he's here to help me, let him help me. And so she stands by and watches as this doctor performs emergency surgery on Rotfield. And it's really hard for her to kind of stand there and watch, and she has to obey his order of letting the doctor do what the doctor wants to do, while also watching as the doctor is slicing her master open. But the procedure doesn't go very well, and pretty soon the golem realizes that she's losing her connection with her master, and as he dies, it breaks. And where her mind was once filled with the thoughts and feelings and desires of her master, she's now kind of flooded with the thoughts, feelings, and desires of everybody on the ship. Anyway, soon enough, the ship arrives in New York and the golem manages to evade the ticket inspectors. And now she's just alone in New York City. She doesn't have a name. She doesn't have a master. She doesn't have directions. She has no purpose. And that's the setup. That was the first chapter, and I was captivated. Immediately I disliked Rotfield, so I was pleasantly surprised that he died in our first chapter. Got rid of him real quick. To be fair, the golem's master dying is actually mentioned on the blurb, but I haven't read that in 4 or 5 months, so I forgot. Anyway, we're now in New York City in 1899. I'm sure at some point we're going to meet the Djinni as well, and I'm just so curious to see what this golem is going to get up to. How is she going to survive? I'm in. I'm already invested. After I read the first chapter, I was so excited. I was telling Blair that I'm getting I'm getting really good vibes from this. But then he promptly burst my bubble and reminded me that last time I did this challenge, I had a similar feeling after reading the prologue that, everything just it went downhill from there. So I'm trying not to get my hopes up too high, but I have some really good feelings about this one. But I suppose there's nothing left to do but to get to reading. Good morning, friends. I've been busy reading. I'm up to chapter 11, which is page 213, so I'm about a third of the way through. After meeting the golem in the first chapter, which I've told you about, the second chapter we jumped right into meeting the Djinni. We're introduced to a tinsmith who works in Little Syria in New York. His name is Arbili, and he's a Catholic from Lebanon. When one day one of his customers walks in with a beautiful flask, she says it's a family heirloom and she just wants him to kind of fix it up a little bit. There's a little bit of damage on it. And Arbili immediately recognizes that this flask is probably much more valuable and much older than his customer first thought. And you can probably see where this is going, but during his time handling it and looking over it, something happens, and then all of a sudden there's a man on the floor of his shop with an iron bar around his wrist. And this man is, of course, the Djinni. And the Djinni is really upset because he realizes that that must mean at some point he was captured and tricked by a wizard and kind of forced into this human form. Together they work out that the Djinni has been in the flask for about 1,000 years. Arbili quickly realizes that this Djinni is going to have a lot of trouble kind of just surviving in Manhattan in the late 1800s all by himself. And the Djinni's quite a powerful Djinni, and he has control over most metals other than iron, and he can kind of melt and create things just in his hand. So together they concoct this plan to basically pass the Djinni off as Arbili's new apprentice. In the meantime, Arbili kind of tries to, teach him the ways of people in the late 19th century. However, as the book continues, we kind of see the Djinni really struggling with the containment and the rigidity and the expectations of being a human. Where once he kind of could, float on the winds and become a jackal at, just the thought of it and do whatever he wanted essentially. But now he's not just stuck in a human body, he's also stuck with all of the bullshit that comes along with human society. And although he understands that Arbili is just trying to help him, parts of him can't help but rebel against all of these expectations and these rules. And one of the ways in which he chooses to do this is by seducing a young, very wealthy maiden. And it's just the beginning of her season where, she's supposed to be trying to find the perfect husband, the perfect match. And instead she ends up having sex with a Djinni on her balcony. Anyway, so that's mostly what's been happening with the Djinni for the first 200 pages. Back to the golem though. As I mentioned, at the end of the first chapter, we left off with the golem arriving in New York City and just kind of evading the ticket checkers, inspectors, that's the word. She kind of roams New York City for a little while very aimlessly, and she's just hearing all of these desires and needs and wants from pretty much everybody in New York City. It's very overwhelming. And she's doing her best to ignore them, but then there is one moment where she sees a man walk past her with like a big pretzel or something, I think it was, and at the same time she hears a little boy right next to her thinking about how hungry he is, how he's starving. And so as a matter of almost impulse and instinct, she kind of snatches the pretzel or whatever it was, I can't quite remember, out of the wealthy man's hand and hands it to the poor kid. And he's kind of shocked by it and he just runs off. But the crowd kind of is like, what the hell did you just do? And starts like kind of aggressively coming towards the golem, demanding answers. And she's not quite sure what to do. And she's realizing that she's not quite sure what she's going to do. Like she's worried that something is like she's going to lose control basically. When a man kind of sweeps in and pretends to know her, quickly pays the guy who had the food stolen and kind of de-escalates the situation very quickly. And we find out that this older man is a rabbi who had kind of noticed her a little while back and was following her because he had a suspicion. He was pretty sure he knew what she was, which of course is a golem. So he essentially rescues her from this situation that could have gotten out of control, and he kind of becomes her guardian. We find out that she can't sleep, and so she finds the night times really difficult, and she kind of starts like just doing things to occupy her time. One of the things that she falls in love with is baking. And one night she bakes so much food for the rabbi that he is like, I can't eat all this food. We have to give some of it away. And so he takes her down to meet his nephew, who runs kind of like a refuge for Jewish immigrants. And they essentially donate all of this food to the men who are staying at the shelter. And they come up with a little bit of a backstory for her. And the rabbi mentions to his nephew that he needs to find her a job at some point. And so he, kind of like taken by how beautiful her baking is, mentions that there's a bakery down the road looking for workers. And so they manage to score her a job at the bakery. And although she finds some elements of this really difficult, there are other parts of it that she just kind of excels at. So she ends up doing pretty well, and she makes enough money to be able to rent her own room. And honestly, the relationship between the golem and this rabbi is really quite sweet. It's almost like this grandfatherly granddaughter relationship. And we learn throughout the chapters that not only does this rabbi like have a sense of what golems are, but he actually has the power to destroy her. He knows the words that are needed to destroy her. And at first he's pretty confident that that's the thing that he should do, right? But he very quickly develops this soft spot for her, and like she's so sweet and innocent and naive that he can't bring himself to do it. And one of the things that I thought was really powerful is we get a little bit of a snapshot into this rabbi's backstory and his history. And we learn that while he was training, I think, or at some point during his education, he was instructed to create like just a small kind of clumsy looking golem and to bring it to life, which he does. And we see him do this. And he's then instructed to like order it to do some things. And we watch as he gives it commands that it follows completely and absolutely. These commands start off pretty low key, but then he sees a spider in the corner and he commands the golem to kill the spider. And he kind of watches in horror as this miniature little like stick man starts pummeling the spider. Even once it's like far gone beyond dead, it keeps attacking the spider. And the rabbi says like he commands it to stop, but it just won't. And so then his teacher hands him the words that you say to destroy a golem, which he quickly does. And then his teacher informs him that golems are like beasts at their heart, and that, you know, they will follow all the commands of their master until they get a taste for violence. And then they just can't help themselves. They just become these violent, erratic beasts. And so now we understand the line that he's walking with our golem in New York. The choice he made not to destroy her is a really like heavy and complicated one. Oh, I should mention too that both the golem and the djinni have now received names. The rabbi gives the name Chava to the golem, and the djinni settles on the name Ahmad for himself, although he kind of resents it because it's not the sound of his real name. So that's what's going on so far with the golem and the djinni. But I will say that this story, I've had the realization that in a way it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Starless Sea. And I mean that in a few ways. I mean that firstly in the way that this book kind of feels very atmospheric, and it feels very like storyteller, fairy tale like, but I also mean it in terms of the kind of breadth of stories that we're getting. I've mostly told you about the Golem and the Djinni and what's up with them, but while all of that is happening, we're also learning the backstory of the Djinni in particular, but then also a lot of the people around the Golem and the Djinni, we're getting insight into their own stories as well. So a lot of this book is taken up with like backstories of secondary characters, not so much plot of the Golem and the Djinni. And I guess I kind of have an assumption to some extent that a lot of these things are going to come together in some kind of way towards the end of the book. And I am really enjoying that. I'm enjoying just kind of, I feel like I'm just spending time in this world and with these characters. Everything feels very rich and dynamic, I suppose. Equally though, I don't really feel like there's a lot of momentum. I don't really feel yet like we're heading anywhere, like there's a lot of direction with plot or anything. So I can see how some readers who maybe don't enjoy the characters or the atmosphere might find this a little bit slow or tedious. For now, at least, I'm just really enjoying spending time with these characters and in this world. And like this sense of entanglement is starting to be created, like the connections between the people. It's not super explicit yet, but I can see it kind of weaving towards each other, if that makes sense. And I just like the way in which we're getting this world building and this context in a non-info dumpy kind of way. So essentially, I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't know that I love where this is going because I don't really have a sense of that yet. But what I do know is that I'm just enjoying spending time in this book. Now, the last chapter that I read kind of did throw a spanner into the works a little bit. Basically, we jumped back to Shulman, the rabbi from the very beginning who created the golem back in Poland. And we learned that since Rotfield left with his golem, this rabbi, Shulman, hasn't been able to stop thinking about them. And so he performs this little like ceremony ritual thing to like see where they are. And he learns pretty quickly that Rotfield is at the bottom of the ocean. And so he at first assumes that the golem must be too. But then his vision kind of changes and he realizes that she's in New York. And so the end of that chapter is him setting off to New York as well. And so I'm getting a sense that maybe he's going to become our antagonist. I'm not sure. But anyway, there's your update. I'm going to get back to reading and I will check in with you again soon. Hello friends and welcome to our next check-in. I am up to chapter 22, page 446, which means I'm a little over 2/3 of the way through this book. Firstly, I'll just say that I don't know that my feelings have changed drastically from the last time we checked in. Overall, I'm still really enjoying the tone. I'm really enjoying the characters, but I'm not like obsessed or, you know, completely riveted by the plot because there is plot, but there's not a lot of it. I don't want to be too unfair to this book. It's not like an entirely slice of life plotless book. So let's talk about what has been happening. So the last thing I told you about was the fact that the disgraced rabbi who created the golem was making his way from Poland to New York. Partly that is because he was curious about the golem herself, but also because he had a bit of a vision that the answer to like immortality, life eternal, was in New York. And this is something that he has been like seeking, it seems, for a long time. And so he's not quite sure yet how or if the golem features into his search for life eternal, but he knows that he needs to make his way to New York. And so in this section that I've just read, he has arrived and he's basically like infiltrated the Jewish shelter that I mentioned that the rabbi's nephew works at. The nice rabbi, the rabbi we like, who's been looking after Hava, the golem. The golem is still working at the bakery. However, at some point, the rabbi, her friend, passed away. And so she feels really unmoored, I suppose is the right word. Even though she's doing well at the bakery, she has her own place, she's lost her only friend in the world, and certainly the only person who knows the truth about her. And so after the rabbi's death, she does actually spend a little bit of time with Michael, his nephew, who runs the shelter. And she quite likes him, but she recognizes quite early on, you know, given her little like telepathic abilities, that he's got the hots for her, doesn't he? And that makes her uncomfortable. She doesn't want to get involved with anyone. So she kind of distanced herself from him. In the meantime, the Djinni and the golem have now met. They kind of ran into each other one night just after the rabbi had died. So the golem was kind of, she wasn't feeling right, she wasn't herself. But as soon as they locked eyes, they like immediately recognized that each other, like they were not human. The Djinni says to the golem, "You're made of clay, like what are you?" And the golem can see that the Djinni is made of fire. Anyway, after a little bit of back and forth, they decide to once a week spend the evenings together, just like wandering around New York. For Ahmad, the Djinni, it's almost like he wants to, I don't know, encourage a bit of rebelliousness and fire within the golem, because Hava is such a cautious person. Obviously, with good reason. She's terrified of being discovered, terrified that that would then either lead to her harming people or her being destroyed herself. Whereas the Djinni is centuries old and, you know, he's used to being almost all powerful. So this human like form and, like I said, human society feels kind of beneath him. And so he's almost frustrated by Hava, that she feels the need to make herself smaller, I suppose. That's almost infuriating to him. And so on these little evenings out once a week, they actually do end up like arguing and fighting quite often because they're so different. But at the end of the day, they both don't sleep. So they need to do something with their evenings. And the fact that they finally met somebody who gets it, you know, even if they have different perspectives on how they should go about the situations that they're in, at the end of the day, they're both aliens to this human world. And so that very simple but really base instinct kind of thing keeps them connected. And over time, they do develop like a really sweet friendship. It's kind of cute. Now back to Shulman, the disgraced rabbi. One day he walks into the bakery and he doesn't really recognize the golem at first, but what he does feel is like he's cast this spell on himself to try and help him find the key to immortality, and like whatever that is starts like beeping, going off inside him when he notices the golem. And through that he then recognizes her and goes, oh my god, my golem's like here in the city living and working as a fucking baker, what? But then he kind of catches himself because he realizes that the golem has like sensed his recognition of her, essentially. Like she knows that someone in that bakery has like seen her for her true self, and she starts to freak out a little bit and tries to look around, but obviously she doesn't recognize the rabbi. She's never seen Shulman before. She was fast asleep when they put her on that ship. So he quickly darts out of the bakery, but he now knows that his golem's alive, knows where she is, and also knows that she does have something to do with this like thing that he's looking for immortality. So there's definitely like a suggestion of something interesting happening down that line. And I suppose hearing myself talk, it does sound like there is an awful lot of plot and a lot of things going on. But all of that has been in over 200 pages, and like I said, the world building and everything, it's done implicitly for the most part, I would say. For the majority of the pages I've been reading, we're just spending time with the Golem and the Djinni walking around New York late at night. We're spending time with Shulman, like helping out the cook at the shelter. I suppose there's just like a lot of breathing space and time with characters. Essentially, the plot is just unraveling at a very like natural pace with the characters. And in the last couple of chapters, there's been a pretty important development. Essentially, Hava has committed violence and she kind of lost herself. She was out for a night on the town with her friends, and then, you know, because it was getting late and it was her night to meet the Djinni, she went and got Ahmad and kind of like brought him along with her, and they spent the evening dancing, and they both just loved it, and it was so beautiful. It was one of my favorite scenes. But then one of Hava's friends, Anna from the bakery, her boyfriend is like abusing her out in the street, and Hava goes to check on her and just kind of loses it. And she literally is like bashing this man to a pulp, and it's clear that she doesn't even know what's happening. It's just like once the violence started, like her consciousness was almost gone and just replaced by this like savage inner beast. And Ahmad is doing his best to stop her, but like she's very powerful, and eventually Hava comes to and realizes what she's done, and she's devastated. I think in a moment of panic, she kind of half blames the Djinni for his like recklessness wearing off on her. And so she tells the Djinni that they shouldn't see each other anymore. And it's really sad. And in that moment, Hava decides that she's going to destroy herself. She found the words needed to destroy a golem at the rabbi's house after he passed away, and she's been keeping it in a locket ever since, just in case. But while she was kind of like blacked out, the Djinni kind of like, he stole those words out of her locket. So he now has the words to destroy her. So instead, and in desperation, she decides that she needs a new guardian. Not necessarily someone who knows her true nature as a golem, but somebody who is good and kind and true to kind of like keep her in check and keep her on the straight and narrow. And so she goes to Michael Levy, the nephew of the rabbi who works at the shelter, and says, will you marry me? And of course he's smitten with her, so he says yes. And one of the last things I read was Shulman, the dodgy rabbi from back in Poland, walking her down the aisle. He managed to put a spell on himself that kind of protects him from like Hover, like hearing his thoughts and feelings. So now he can safely hide in plain sight and she has no idea who he is. But obviously through Michael and through the shelter and through their connection, he now has immediate access to her, and I have no idea what he plans to do with that proximity. So yeah, there's definitely been plot development. Maybe I was being a bit too harsh, but like I said, the overall story and like the reading experience feels quite steady and atmospheric rather than like fast-paced plot points coming at you from every angle, you know? And I'm honestly really enjoying that. So yeah, this update is more plot related so that we can hopefully talk about the ending next time I chat with you. And I am starting to get a little bit nervous about Shulman and what the fuck he's gonna get up to. But anyway, I've got almost exactly 200 pages to go, and I want to know what happens, so I'm going to get to reading. Okay friends, we finally made it all the way to the end of this 650 page book. I'm so proud of myself. Like I said at the beginning of this video, it's been a long time coming, being able to say that I have finished an adult fantasy novel, certainly one of this length. So I'm feeling chuffed. And on top of that, I actually really enjoyed this book. So it's just nice to know that I'm not cursed for big books, you know, because I thought that was the road we were heading down earlier this year. Okay, so just in case it's not clear already, this is a spoiler-filled vlog. I'm not going to go through every single little detail. Like if you watch this video and, you know, read this book a few months later, there'll still be plenty of surprises for you along the way. But now we are going to get into like the ending itself. So if that's something you don't want to be spoiled for, then maybe come back and watch this video after you've read this book. I do, however, have a confession to make, and that is that pretty early on in this book, I accidentally got spoiled myself for like the big reveal. If you can hear noises, because Ollie's playing with herself in the mirror, like she's... That sounded terrible. You know what I mean? She thinks her reflection is funny, and she likes to watch herself playing with her toys in the mirror. So where did we leave off? We left off with the Golem marrying Michael Levy, and with Shulman, the rabbi who created the Golem, kind of like on her tail. Well, pretty quickly Hava and Michael kind of settle into their wife-husband dynamic, which is a little bit cold in a way. Like they do like each other quite a lot, but their dynamic is just a little bit off. Partly because they just don't know each other very well, but then obviously also because Hava's a golem. But then he comes across his uncle's diaries and notes from the time when he met Hava. And in that, the rabbi has like explicitly written how he's met this golem and he's named her Hava. And he's just kind of really starting to freak out at this point. Like there's too many coincidences lining up, and as mad as it seems that his wife might be a clay monster, it's hard not to believe it, you know? Anyway, in the meantime, Shulman's kind of like spell that he put on himself to help him find the key to immortality has been going off a little bit around the Djinni. And finally, Shulman finds the Djinni and they have this moment of meeting. And Shulman has this power where he often like will hold the wrist of people, and it seems to give him like a power over them where he can like ask them questions or read their mind a little bit, but only for short periods of time. And so he does that to the Djinni. But then what transpires over like an entire chapter is the kind of like melding of their two memories. And so we see kind of like flip-flopping back and forth between the two of them, how their lives are interconnected. And it's really beautifully kind of like expressed and told, like I said, across a whole chapter. But basically the essence of it is that Shulman is the reincarnation of the wizard who trapped the Djinni 1,000 years ago. Basically, to trap a Djinni, you have to like bind them to yourself for life. Pretty soon after trapping Ahmad as a Djinni 1,000 years ago, the wizard then put him back in the flask, and he was pretty promptly killed himself. But obviously the Djinni is still alive, which means that the wizard himself cannot truly die. And so he has spent the last 1,000 years reincarnating into new bodies all over the world with like one desperate driving goal, which is like this frenzied obsession with finding the answer to immortality. Obviously ironic given that he kind of already had the key, he just didn't know it. And so the wizard who trapped the Djinni, being the same person as the disgraced rabbi, Shulman, who created the golem, is the thing that I got spoiled on. So I didn't get spoiled on something small, I got spoiled on the thing. And it's my own fault, because while I was reading early on, I couldn't help myself. I was having a little bit of a gander at the reviews on GoodReads. Once you see a spoiler like that, it only takes up a few words. You can't unsee it, right? But I still enjoyed the execution of the reveal. You know, like there's kind of like a few elements to liking a reveal. There's like liking the reveal itself and then liking how it's done. And I can imagine it would have been a pretty powerful, shocking moment if you hadn't been spoiled like I had. Anyway, the Djinni manages to kind of like escape this confrontation, and he kind of has the realization that while he lives, Shulman will always continue to live too. He will always be reborn into new bodies. So he decides to go to a fountain to attempt to extinguish / kill himself. But the golem manages to save him, and then of course the Djinni lets the golem know what's been going on and who Shulman really is. So they devise this plan to put the Djinni back in the flask and for Hava and him to kind of like hop on a boat and head back over to Syria to try and like escape and run away from Shulman. Because obviously the Djinni does not want to be controlled by Shulman. His freedom is the most important thing to him, and he's also worried about what he's going to do to Hava. And we've learnt that he has a spell to bind her to a new master. It does require her consent, but we know Shulman is willing to play dirty. And as far as he's concerned, coerced consent is still consent. But before they can put the Djinni back in the flask, Shulman summons him because, of course, they are still linked and he is still bound by his master's will. And so the Golem and the Djinni go to meet Shulman. When they arrive, Shulman has kind of like kidnapped Anna, Hava's friend from the bakery. And he basically says, I'm going to do horrible, horrible things to her unless you consent to become my Golem. And so she agrees and he casts a little spell and now she is controlled again. And then he orders Hava to perform the spell to put the Djinni back in the flask because it's a very powerful spell and it takes a lot out of you and he doesn't quite have the energy anymore. And she starts to perform the spell facing him and he freaks out and says, no, you need to face the Djinni, you idiot girl, which is our clue. Because in the wings of all of this happening, another secondary character that I have not spoken a lot about happens to have followed the Djinni and the Golem to this situation. And so in a moment of like distraction, he manages to grab the flask and perform the spell facing Shulman. As I said, it's a very powerful spell and it takes everything out of this man and he dies, but it works and Shulman is captured and put into the flask. And he's sealed there now, I suppose, for as long as the flask remains closed. And that's pretty much the ending. There is then an epilogue that kind of shows the Golem still just going about her everyday life. And it seems that now that she has a master, maybe like the thoughts and feelings of everybody around her aren't influencing her as much. But because her master is like trapped in a moment in time in the flask, he has no influence on her either. So she seems like she might be a little bit different from like her free self, but she still is not entirely controlled, if that makes sense. Oh, and also I missed it, but at some point Shulman killed Michael, her husband. So, I mean, she's a widow now too, I guess. But the Djinni decides that he needs to return home to Syria to go and see if his people, other Djinni, are still alive, to find out if they've found a way to free him in the 1,000 years since he was first captured. But they inform him that unfortunately they don't know how to free him. But because they understand the predicament that while the Djinni lives, Shulman will always live too. And he is clearly a very powerful, scary wizard who's out to capture jinn and other magical creatures. They inform him that they plan to kill him because that will kill Shulman. And Ahmad basically tells them like he understands, but if they're going to give him a choice, he would really rather go back to New York. And they agree only if they can keep the flask and they're going to protect it and make sure that it never opens. And that's the ending. I feel like there were quite a lot of details to like let you know about there. But now let's have a little chat about how I'm feeling about it all. So I know I said a couple of times throughout this video that it didn't feel super plot heavy. And I suppose I want to reframe that a little bit because obviously I've spent a lot of this video detailing like steps along the way of the plot. Like that's plot. I suppose what I mean is that it all just felt very steady. It didn't feel kind of like fast paced. It didn't feel like a lot was happening. And as I mentioned, it all felt quite organic to the characters and what they were doing. And I didn't really feel like we ever had any moments of info dumping. And I think on top of that, maybe what I was more getting at is that the plot didn't feel like it had a particular direction or a huge amount of momentum. Like I wasn't reading kind of with the anticipation of where we were heading. I was just reading and spending time with these characters and then things happened to happen. I really loved the juxtaposition that we got between the Djinni and the Golem and just how different they were. Obviously, just like on a base elemental level, one is made of earth, the other fire, but we see that so clearly in their actions and their desires as well. Hava is so cautious and considered and so concerned with the thoughts and feelings of others and being of service, whereas Ahmad is impulsive and brash and hedonistic. And I think with both of them, obviously there is a pretty strong theme running through their lives of freedom, but I think it's explored in really interesting ways, especially with Hava. For instance, early on she loses her master, and so she is essentially free, and yet the choices and possibilities and the responsibility and all of that of freedom and choice is almost all-consuming and overwhelming to her, to the point that it doesn't feel like freedom in the way that the Djinni thinks of it. And they even have a conversation at one point through the book earlier on where she basically says that she doesn't know that she would say no to having a new master, because in a way she can see that freedom from choice and responsibility is liberating. And we see that explored even further when she and Michael get married. And obviously because she's telepathic, she can hear his thoughts and feelings and his desires. And she finds herself kind of just like bending to his whims to make him happy, to make him comfortable, to like, you know, make the dinner that he's thinking that he would like. She's essentially living as if she has a master without actually having one. Another theme and like topic that is obviously very important to this story is immigration in the late 19th century. Obviously the cultures and folklores that both the Djinni and the Golem like come from and originate from are very important to this book overall, but the cultures and communities that they become entrenched in once they arrive at New York are also immigrant communities, and they are so rich and play such an important role in this book as well. And I think the book really demonstrates how, you know, people make community wherever they go. Like people bring their culture, bring their experiences to wherever it is they find themselves, and they find each other through that. Something else that kind of got me thinking though throughout this book was the idea of this being fantasy. Now, obviously it has fantastical elements, but to me, I think it reads much more like an historical book with mystical, fantastical elements than like a true fantasy. And I think especially because so much of this book is taken up by like literally watching the Djinni and the Golem like try to be human and try to fit into society and to literally go through their day being a baker or being a tinsmith. Like a lot of the book does just explore the very mundane everyday things. And when it does get more grand, a lot of the time it's still exploring concepts like morality and mortality. Very, very human things. They're just explored through the lens and the eyes of these mystical, magical creatures. And it's pretty much just when we get the flashbacks to the Djinni's life before he was captured, and at the very end when Shulman's going all full wizard, that it does feel a little bit more magical. For the most part, it just feels like these two like alien creatures kind of plopped into New York and just trying to get by day. And I think more than fantasy in the way that a lot of the time we think about and talk about that as a genre, this feels more rooted in folklore and mysticism specifically. And I think both are very human, but also the very rich and dynamic aspect of this book is kind of further fleshed out by just how many secondary characters we spend quite a lot of time with. Like obviously we have the rabbi and his nephew Michael Levy, but there were several other characters that I didn't even mention in this video just for time's sake, and because I didn't know how important they were going to be to the plot. I think I briefly mentioned the heiress that the Djinni had sex with on the balcony, and of course the man who like comes and saves the day at the very end. We learned lots about him as well. And it kind of feels like there's these character vignettes throughout the story. And I honestly enjoyed all of that. There was not a single character that I wasn't interested in learning more about. Even though every now and then I did feel myself longing for a little bit more direction, at the end of the day I just enjoyed learning about these people and spending time with them. And I think that's just because it was all really, really well fleshed out. Everybody felt so real. And the writing, it was readable and it was clear, but it was still quite beautiful too. It's not the kind of writing where I like felt the need to highlight beautiful passages or there was words that I just wanted to read out to you just so you could hear them roll off my tongue. It's not that kind of writing. And yet it's still evocative and moving. And I think a lot of those things that I've just said, the very like vignette sort of feeling, the threads of different characters winding together, different story aspects without too much direction, it all being more about the unfolding and the discovery than the plot itself. And even the writing to an extent, they do remind me of the Starless Sea. However, there were themes explored in this book that I felt like were just fleshed out with so much more substance than was ever even hinted at in the Starless Sea. I do think that the Starless Sea had a bit more like personality and quirk to the narration, but there's something about the way that this is written that still kind of just gave me the vibes, you know? I will also add briefly that I did really like the audiobook. The narrator had such like a soothing, rhythmic voice that kind of like really lulled me into the story even more. As I mentioned earlier on, I was listening while reading, and I really, really recommend that experience if it's something you like to do too. And so basically, after all of that, I think I would say that I really enjoyed this. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that it's a new favorite book, but I don't think it needs to be. I just enjoyed my time in this so much. I know I keep saying that, but that's just how I feel. So I would say it's kind of sitting around 4-star category. And finally, the other thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that this is the first in a series. There is a sequel to this book. To be clear, this reads very solidly as a standalone. No part of me feels like something is missing or like I need to continue on to find answers to something. This is a very, very self-contained story. So if you're curious about this but don't want to commit to a series, I think you can safely go into this and just enjoy it for what it is. And to be perfectly honest, I think after finishing this, I did not really think I wanted to read the second book. I just felt so happy with how everything had wrapped up. I felt very comfortable with the ending. It was just very satisfying, I suppose. But in the 24 hours since finishing this, I kind of just want to go back. I want to go back to early 20th century New York, and I want to spend more time with Chava and Ahmad. And then I read a review. I know, bold of me, right? But I did. I read a review that said something about the fact that Sophia, the heiress that I mentioned, plays a big role in book number 2, and I really liked her. And so even though it seems like that book was a bit of a hit or a miss for people, depending on what they were expecting after enjoying this one so much, part of me does kind of want to just return to this world and spend time with these characters, even if I'm not that into the plot. Like, I like being here, you know, and I want to go back. And so if you have read this series, and especially if you did get to book 2, please let me know what you think in the comments. Should I read it? Is it worth my time? I would love to hear, but regardless, I am so happy I spent the time I did with this book. So thank you to my patrons for voting on this one, and of course a big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown and Marie for their very generous support. I would love to hear what you think of this book or this video in the comments below, and I will talk to you again soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye.